So our fourth panel and final witness, Mr. Neil Doherty, focused on the trafficking patterns of synthetic cathinones. Mr. Doherty has served as the Associate Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Office of Diversion Control at the Drug Enforcement Administration since January of last year. Before his current appointment, Mr. Doherty served as the Assistant Special Agent in charge of the DEA's Phoenix Field Division. He is a graduate of Norwich University and has completed executive leadership management programs at the University of Notre Dame and U.S. Army War College. Mr. Doherty.
Judge Breyer and members of the Sentencing Commission, thank you for holding this important hearing and the opportunity to appear before you today to talk about synthetic drug trafficking and the effects that we all see in this country relative to synthetic drugs, specifically cathinones. I'm currently a member of DEA's Diversion Control Division, and I think it's important for context to point out that the Diversion Control Division within DEA has both a regulatory and enforcement function for the agency, in that we regulate the approximate 1.8 million registrants in the country that are authorized to manufacture, distribute, prescribe, and handle controlled substances. On the operation and enforcement side of the house, we also provide programmatic oversight to our criminal investigations throughout the country targeting those prescribers and registrants operating outside the law, the dirty doctors, rogue pharmacists, pill mill operators, and we also track NPS, synthetic drugs, and provide support to our workforce relative to these investigations. Synthetic substances continue to cross our borders at an alarming rate and put all citizens of all ages, especially our youth, at risk of permanent injury or death. The drug threat remains a focus for DEA, along with the opioid crisis, which has been compounded in complexity with the advent of illicit fentanyl pouring into our country. The convergence of synthetic drug trafficking and the opioid epidemic represent a deadly perfect storm which this nation has never experienced. Synthetic cathinones are highly dangerous substances that are marketed as a legal high and have adverse effects that are unpredictable in their psychological and physical impact on each user. These substances are easily available through various outlets from the internet, convenience stores, gas stations, street dealers, and drug trafficking organizations. Anyone can easily order these substances, have them directly shipped to their doorstep without detection, or purchase them locally without scrutiny. These substances are marketed to consumers as glass cleaner, bath salt, plant food, and often are labeled not for human consumption as a means, false means, to defend against the government's utilization of the Federal Controlled Analog Enforcement Act, the Analog Act, which requires proof that the substances were indeed intended for human consumption. Synthetic cathinones are primarily manufactured in and imported into the U.S. from China. They are produced from a variation of chemicals by foreign chemists and shipped into the U.S. usually in powder form. After entering the U.S., the substances are often mixed with other substances and placed in capsule, tablet, or powder form. They are then packaged for distribution as various brand names such as Molly and Flocka throughout U.S. distribution warehouses within our borders. These substances can range, and the traffickers dealing with these substances can range from large-scale poly-drug trafficking organizations to individuals who either package the substances for resale in small quantities or distribute the drugs in kilogram quantities. What is the reason for the sustained criminal interest in synthetics? What is the motivation behind the often deadly tactics relative to this drug? In a word, profit. Synthetic cathinones provide criminal organizations with highly elevated margins for profit and illicit revenue. For example, 1 kilogram of a synthetic cathinone purchased in China for between $2,000 and $5,000 can reap $250,000 once that kilogram is broken down into 1 or 2 gram packages within our borders and sold for $20 each per package. Even though we have had success against members of criminal synthetic organizations, there remains frustration. Foreign-based cathinone manufacturers and their domestic collaborators often operate with impunity because they exploit loopholes in the analog provisions of the Controlled Substance Act and capitalize on the lengthy, resource-intensive, and reactive process required to temporarily or permanently schedule these dangerous substances. As we speak criminal chemists in foreign countries are tweaking the molecular structure of different synthetic cathinones, keeping the same dangerous pharmacological properties as the controlled substances, but helping the manufacturers and distributors avoid criminal exposure because of an altered molecular state. DEA has utilized Emergency Control Authority on 15 occasions to place 45 designer drugs, to include 13 cathinones, temporarily into Schedule 1. Recently, DEA published 2 notices of intent to temporarily initiate the control of 4 additional synthetic drugs for possible control. This is critically important, but we realize this is a reactive, resource-intensive process that leaves us steps behind the criminals that we investigate. We will continue to do everything we can on the scheduling front. However, simultaneously, this esteemed body could provide DEA and our law enforcement partners with immediate relief by adopting a class approach to these deadly substances. DEA understands the unique challenges posed by this constantly evolving threat and remains hopeful for a class approach that would treat a new synthetic cathinone the same as others in the same drug class. For DEA and our federal, state, and local partners to be successful in dealing with this threat, we need a balanced whole-of-government approach, one that attacks supply and also works to reduce demand. We need to lean forward and use all available investigative techniques to identify, infiltrate, indict, capture, and convict all members of these foreign organizations, foreign and domestic. With 221 domestic offices in 21 field divisions and 92 foreign offices in 70 countries, DEA, through domestic and international collaboration, is well positioned to engage in this fight. Our most challenging victories were won through teamwork across agency lines, and stemming the tide of this threat will similarly require all hands on deck. The brave men and women of the DEA remain committed to doing everything they can to address this threat. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I look forward to any questions that you may have.
If I may, in your testimony, and in your written testimony as well as your oral testimony today, you use the example of a kilogram coming in from China that then costs, or to be sold, it's $2,000 to $5,000. Then you go on to say, and then it's cut and broken down into 1 to 2 gram packages. When you say it's cut, are you saying it's then that the cut is mixing it with other chemicals, other substances?
So, Commissioner, that's an excellent question. We see this come in kilogram form from China, usually and generally via mail systems, private mail and the U.S. mail. Once it is within our borders, many times it's packaged in its intended form, in its pure form as it comes in. Many times it's cut. It's cut with amphetamine. It's cut with other drugs. Traffickers try to maximize that kilogram for the most profit, but many times it doesn't need to be cut. But we have seen instances where it is cut with other substances.
And I'm trying to figure out, let's say you have a street dealer who goes to a rave party or something and sells these things for, as you point out, $20 a package, and has 10 packages. So, you know, so that's a particular quantity. Trying to figure out whether we've really addressed the harm that could be caused by that. If you don't take into account, or if you do take into account, how it's been cut down. Do you think that it ought to be, from the DEA's point of view, should you take a look at it to see whether it's cut, or should you take a look or should you ignore that and simply weigh it and see if it has some trace of the cathinone?
Well, Commissioner, that's an excellent point. And from DEA's perspective, with our forensic laboratories, take Molly, for example, which is marketed under the false pretense of being the purest form of MDMA. Our laboratory investigations show that Molly, purported Molly, seemingly pure MDMA that the individuals think they're taking, is extremely dangerous and contains variations of several cathinones, some scheduled and some not. So to your point, that is something that we take into consideration.
What if it's sold like the bath salts or the glass, so they're not going to a dealer? So I'm just trying to get a handle on when it's sold as these other products, so it's a gas station or it's some kind of store and it's the bath salts what's your enforcement strategy for something like that? How do you investigate a case like that to figure out who's responsible for putting that where it is and that it's not really bath salts? I mean, I guess it's a little weird if it's in your gas station, but how do you go about kind of taking what is otherwise a lawful product, if it was for the intended use of a bath or glass cleaner, and trace it back to a drug distribution network? How do you investigate those cases?
So, again, another excellent question. That is certainly a challenge for law enforcement based on prosecutions under the Analog Act, which requires proof that these substances indeed intended for human consumption. However, like any investigation that DEA conducts, we rely on a series of traditional and non-traditional law enforcement techniques: tips, confidential informants, and ground truth with respect to intelligence with our state and local partners. Many times, our synthetic investigations start with local police departments bringing us information, and we expand upon the investigation from there. As I said, the bulk material coming in is shipped into the country, misbranded, mislabeled, and then once it arrives here, the DTOs, the drug trafficking organizations, and collaborators here within the continental United States will package and repackage that, sometimes as Molly or Flocka, as we saw the trend in South Florida, or sometimes under other seemingly innocuous brand names to be sold in the stores that you mentioned, gas stations and other places. So in terms of, we always enter any criminal investigation at the appropriate point in terms of the evidence and the information that we have. But to your point, if we're looking at, say, a gas station that has packages on the counter and we know that indeed is a synthetic drug, then we would investigate
Do you make much money
the
off those?
establishment.
Like, how much are those sold for when they're,
$10 to $20,
oh, so it's like a $20 pack of bath salts?
potentially,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay.
If we take this class approach, and I think everyone here is pretty much in favor of doing that, but if we set the penalties too low, that it doesn't provide a deterrence, are we creating more of a problem than we have now?
I think, well, that's an excellent point, and I think that from DEA's perspective, with the challenges that we currently face, we would encourage a class approach with appropriate set penalties. So to your point, Commissioner, the penalties being set too low may be problematic.
It may encourage more use perhaps than deter conduct.
Correct.
Have you seen, in law enforcement the last couple of years, have you seen an uptick or a change in how these drugs are being sold to the public?
Well, sir, some of our major enforcement operations during 2002, Operation Logjam, which was the first synthetic takedown of its kind nationally with our state, local, and federal partners, had a deterrent effect. And certainly our scheduling actions, both from a permanent basis and a temporary emergency basis, also have a deterrent effect. Our second major iteration of a national takedown was Project Synergy. That had 3 separate takedowns, 2013, 14, and 15, respectively. So while the aggressive enforcement posture that DEA has taken on this matter had a deterrent, we still see these substances crossing our border. Are they as prevalent? I think they've gone underground quite a bit. I think the internet and the dark net traffics these things a lot more heavily than they did when they were readily available in the streets.
So are you saying it's harder to detect it? Are you saying it's harder to detect it, that they've gone underground and so DEA is having a problem in
Yes, Commissioner.
detection?
Yes, Commissioner. One of our major challenges is certainly the internet trafficking of these substances and the dark net. I would also add to...
Like the Silk Road?
I'm sorry, sir?
The Silk Road.
Silk Road, sure. The Silk Road, Tor, the onion router, anonymity. It provides the shipper and the receiver a curtain to hide behind, both on the receiving and distribution end. We had some success recently with the Alpha Bay takedown, which was a national takedown. Again, they will find a way to traffic these things on the internet after enforcement actions.
Thank you, Mr. Doherty.
Thank you, Commissioner.
That concludes our public hearing. We are adjourned.